Are you struggling with the fear of the unknown and wondering if therapy can help? Well, then stick around because in this episode of the Mental Health Toolbox, we are talking with mental health therapist and host of the Discover More podcast, Benoit Kim. He shares his wisdom on how to face uncertainty and pivots in life and career. So let's go.
But we often forget, and this is a hopeful message, hopefully, that the macro is comprised of the micro, aka individual decision makers like us, who happen to choose the policy sector realm or political realm or whatever. At the same time, hurt people. So I think we need to address the micro, the individual aspect of trauma, mental health, or whatever before we talk about the macro, which is a systematic change. But I am hopeful, even though I'm pretty cynical from my political or my policy backgrounds. But I do feel like societally at large, we are moving towards the right directions.
Benoit Kim is a UPenn-educated former policymaker turned therapist and host of the Discover More podcast, a show for introspective thinkers with growth mindsets seeking authentic life stories. The show is a top globally 5% podcast and was featured on Apple Podcasts' top chart 200 twice this past year. You can learn more about Benoit and the work he's doing and his podcast by visiting the links in the description below. So let's meet Benoit. Welcome, Benoit. Thank you so much for making time to be on the Mental Health Toolbox podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time to drop in and share some nuggets of wisdom.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And super excited to share my advocacy for mental health and what mental health and its avenue means to me with the listeners. So excited to see what happens on the show today.
Absolutely. I know you have a wealth of experience with change, with rolling with the punches, right? Life is full of uncertainty, and I know you definitely have a lot to share about that. You are a therapist, right? But we're not always a therapist. You had a prior career before in policymaking.
Yeah.
So, yeah, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about your background, and we'll jump in from there.
Yeah, before I answer that question, I want to share something I share with my clients often. I feel like a lot of our clients and patients view psychotherapists, whether you're social workers, psychologists, everything in between, they view us as this advice spitting machines without emotions. They just want to come to us and, give me short-term fix, magically upgrade my life overnight. And of course, to that, I say therapy is not a place of me changing your life per se, but just a space of self-explorations and where I hopefully can help you going from stuck to unstuck. I share that because I was stuck in my former identity of a policymaker. I went to graduate school at University of Pennsylvania, which is the #1 school in the country for education policy, because I think there is a lot of different avenues and vehicles for change. As a lawyer, as a physician, as therapists like you and I, Patrick, we can maybe impact hundreds of people every year, which is still a deep honor and privilege to bear witness to people's pain and help them grow in the way they see fit. At the same time, as a policymaker, you can impact thousands and hundreds of thousands with the signature of a bill, with creating of a policy. At the same time, I've seen so many people who held this utilitarian impact, as I did philosophically, in terms of the ends always justify the means. What I mean by that is we are often faced with certain temptations and the need to compromise our moral compass for the sake of impact. At the same time, nobody wakes up and smokes 20 packs of cigarettes. You always start with the first cigarette. Nobody wakes up and finishes the entire bottle of Jack Daniel. You start with the first shot. And that's what I sort of witnessed in my policymaking journey for the last 6 years, where I've seen great people in policy for the great intention becoming a different versions of themselves for the sake of impact. Like if I were to ask you, Patrick, would you sign a bill that might be compromising to your moral compass and you may lose a night or 2 nights of sleep? Would you do that? I think both of us would say yes. But then through iterations of time, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, that moral compromise is going to get bigger and bigger and get exacerbated by the needs of policy. And I didn't want to go down that route. So I chose to pivot. But most importantly, most societal issue I was really deeply passionate about, I realized what the byproduct of unattended mental health issue, intergenerational trauma, poverty, or some combination thereof. So I took my L and I did get jaded in the policy sector because it's so much more than just the politics people talk about. And I wanted to choose my battle and I wanted to come down from the macro, which is the political aspect, to the micro, which is the clinical. And I've been doing that for the past couple of years.
I think that's fantastic, right? Because I remember graduate school, there's really like two courses there. There's macro social work, right? Think tank. And then there's, micro, where you're in the trenches and doing the one-on-one. And they're both very important, like you said, and very different impacts. But like I talk to my clients a lot about is doing things on purpose for purpose and putting your attention with your intention, right? And knowing why you're getting into the business you're getting into. I really appreciate you sharing, your lived experience, right, with what can transpire, right? How your intentions can morph into something that's unintended if we're not being present about the work we're doing, right?
Yeah, and also I think this saying has been going around online, but hurt people hurts people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us often get distracted or forget the fact that the macro is comprised of the micro. The macro, this totalistic system that we view from the outside as how can anyone ever change the system? Because we have so many systematic issues. But we often forget, and this is a hopeful message, hopefully, that the macro is comprised of the micro, aka individual decision makers like us, who happen to choose the policy sector realm or political realm or whatever. At the same time, hurt people hurt people. So I think we need to address the micro, the individual aspect of trauma, mental health, or whatever, before we talk about the macro, which is a systematic change. But I am hopeful, even though I'm pretty cynical from my political or my policy backgrounds. But I do feel like societally at large, we are moving towards the right directions, hopefully.
Yes, definitely. And I think you bring up a really good point, right? Because it's like that saying, nobody's better till we're all better kind of thing, right? That we hear. And I'm wondering, with your unique perspective, right, because of your experience and working with clients as a therapist, what do you see as kind of the levers to pull? Like, what do you look for in terms of, because you were talking about being stuck, right? And I think that's why a lot of people seek mental health in the first place. If it's not burnout, right, it's life transition. It's feeling stuck and unsure, fear of the future, fear of making a change, or maybe not knowing what they want, trying to figure that out. So, when you're working with the clients on the micro side, what levers do you think are get the most bang for your buck in terms of what to pull when somebody's feeling stuck?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have two answers to that. I think the first one is I love aligning myself with the client's needs. Because we talk about, like, of course, all these holistic health, air quote, life coaches on Instagram, right? Of course, there are real ones out there, but I am concerned that a lot of them are just picking buzzwords to say the right things, to get noticed. Regardless, a lot of us who are helpers, we talk about meeting clients where they are.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why that is because stages of change. It's also because even we want to create this magical, significant impact or change in clients' lives, if they're not ready for that change, the more you dump on them, the more resistant they become. So that's the first way I want to answer your question is the lever I like to pull is identifying precisely where they are at in terms of their capacity for change, since all of us have the capacity for change. At the same time, all of us have different timelines and readiness and toolkits that's available in our toolbox. Pun intended, given your show name, right? So, right. So that's why I like to start. The second thing is, I think it's the idea of awareness, because I think awareness is like the ethos of all therapy work, whether it's personal development, self-help, reading books, listening to podcasts, or seeing a therapist. It's all about awareness. And I view myself as like the vanguard of their journey. What I mean by that is I don't have savior complex. My job or my intention isn't to change them, but rather, I want to make sure they don't hate therapists after they've seen me, because we could be that reason why they never see a therapist ever again in their lives.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah.
Yeah. And conversely, if we are the vanguards of their healing journey because of us, they may see additional therapists, maybe 3 years down the road. It's about planting the seed. So those are the two levers I like to look at, where first, I want to make sure they don't hate us and our professions, and B, identifying where they're at exactly per their circumstances and timeline. And based on that, I simply ask them, are you happy about the way you're showing up to your loved ones? Are you happy about your version at work? Are you happy about a relational version? Simply reviewing the archives of your behaviors and patterns. And you tell me, I'm not going to dissect and psychoanalyze you. You tell me, are you happy now?
Mm-hmm.
If not, let's talk about it. Let's dissect and unpack some of your behaviors and patterns of why you're not happy the way you want to show up as. If you're happy, great, we'll work on something else. But those two are the levers I like to approach because it's not always about what we have to offer, but where they're at in life.
Wow, that's excellent. It's so true. And when I think about like the whole connotation of happy, when you ask a client like, why are you here? What do you want to work on? What's your goal? Right, your treatment plan. Um, I just want to be happy. Well, what does that mean? Right, because that means something different to everybody. And as therapists, we have that writing reflex. Right, we have
Yeah.
to we have to monitor. At least I do for sure, and being careful that we don't impose change, like you said, on clients just because we want to fix the situation, right? Because we have to first figure out what is the change they want to see, right? Try and get really, really niche, really definitive about it to help them paint that picture, that vision for their future, right? That's where the whole miracle question comes in, right? With solution focused therapy. If things were different and you woke up tomorrow, how would you know, right? If a miracle happened, what would be different? Right. And like you said, you even breaking it down into different life domains, right? Or archives of the different, roles that we play in life, right? The role of
Yeah.
coworker, the role of employee, the role of spouse, son, daughter. We all wear a lot of different hats in our lives, and our level of satisfaction in each one of those can be quite varied.
Yeah. I use a solution focused short term therapy at my work at USC, a counseling center. But I love the miracle question because you show them what's possible on the other side. We're not saying it's eminently possible, but if you see the course through discomfort, through temporary pain, through the growing pain of healing and life, you can see that miracle on the other side, whatever that means. But yeah, I love about the writing reflex you talked about because even before I became a therapist, that was my biggest struggle because I'm a thinker. I have this very preacher persona. I just love talking and I just love providing feedback based on my own unique circumstances. But I've seen a lot of life for fairly young because of different timelines and avenues I went down in life. At the same time, when anyone comes to you for stressors or emotional struggle or dilemma or whatever, nobody likes advice giving machine at that moment. People just want to be heard, be seen, and be cared for. They're not there for advice. So that's something that I continue to work on as my learning edge, especially as a therapist, because we have this dualistic identity as a healer, but also authority figure, like the power dynamics. And a lot of times we do have a lot of influence that a lot of us don't really think about. That's why a lot of licensed therapists lose their licensure because unethical practices every year, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, writing reflex is something I think a lot about. And yeah, at the end of the day, nobody just likes unsolicited feedback, as we talked about before the show briefly. But I think people just want to be heard, be seen, rather than receiving certain advice. Because a lot of times, through clarity, through just patience and less is more mindset, often I think a lot of patients and people can come to their own solutions because we are the experts of certain modalities, but patients are always the experts of their own lives.
Absolutely. I was just thinking about that. That's something that really, in graduate school echoes, patients are the expert of their own lives. And I try and remember that as well, because the answer is usually already there within them. If they can have the space to explore their understanding of their situation without judgment, right? To have a sounding board, right? To think out loud with someone, right? And it's a kind of a funny thing when you talk about advice, because I think I think a lot of people who haven't been in therapy or in the mental health space assume that therapists do give advice, right? When it's sometimes quite the contrary. We're trained not to give advice, right? We're taught to help explore options, but not to necessarily tell people what to do. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic, actually.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the help seekers who come to therapy for the first time, which is amazing if we happen to be that gateway for first time help seekers. But it's funny to see their dissonance or their struggle visibly when they come to you with three specific questions and you're like, oh, can you just give me advice on these three specific questions I've been thinking a lot about? And I never answer those questions.
Hmm.
I always dance around the surface issue
Mhm.
because, as you know, Patrick, our behaviors are often the manifestations of something deeper, just like substance use, addictions, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And through experience and through intuitive feeling, right? Intuition is this weird, inarticulable thing that we all have through mindfulness, through intentionality, and so on. I often pick up these intuitive whisper clinically, and I never address those issues. And I go a little bit deeper, depending on the client's comfortability and the rapport that we have built. But it's always funny and interesting to see the facial expressions of these clients when they realize, wow, he is not going to give me the advice that I want.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a short term fix, but it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, turns some people off and they don't come back,
Mm-hmm.
which is not always pleasant at the same time. I think we all have to understand that our biggest role isn't to just give advice, but truly bear witness to their growth, to their journey, because life isn't easy.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, none of us walk this path of life alone. So at least that's how I view the container of therapy as like a navigation system.
I love that. Absolutely. It's like a compass, right? Getting
Yeah.
your bearings, literally, right? It's a space to get your bearings when you feel lost. Absolutely. I love that. And what you just touched on, really, about the expectations of therapy and what actually happens, I think speaks a lot to that idea of how to get unstuck, right? And sounds like a really unique strategy, right? Because I see myself doing that too in counseling. The same thing you just brought up, client, a help seeker, client, consumer comes seeking a particular outcome, but oftentimes that's not the actual problem, right? And so tunnel vision, right? We all get it. We all get tunnel vision about our problems, and sometimes the more we try and press head on those situations, it's almost like a writer's block, right? We don't see the bigger picture. We don't see the alternative options. We don't see even the other things that are equally, if not more important to our sense of satisfaction, autonomy, agency, right?
Yeah, an analogy just came up where it's like the finger trap, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember the finger
I do.
trap.
Yes.
Yeah. The for just audio listeners, where you have a finger trap, the harder you try to pull against the finger trap, the tighter the trap becomes. And you can, of course, will your power by breaking the finger trap, but that defeats the whole purpose. And the only way out is through, which is by actually retracting back to the original point and letting the trap gets loose and you can sort of take your fingers out. That's sort of how I view what you just said in terms of often cognitively we feel like we have to willpower through. Maybe it's recovery in light of the America's shining hustle, go culture. Rest is for the dead, which is the dumbest thing ever. And a lot of times we have this mindset and this idiosyncratic belief that we have to power through. If we're facing a wall, just tear down the wall down. Well, in theory, that sounds cool, but the last time I checked, our skeleton and our bone density cannot compete with the wall. And the wall is going to win 10 out of 10 times. So the best way to do is actually take a step back and look at the bigger picture, as you alluded to. And I think that comes down to surrender. But now a lot of men hate that word, surrender. What do you mean? Just giving up? Let life happens to us? Well, no. It's rather you can only control how you respond to life, but we can't exert influence on life. That's very funny saying out loud. We can control life. That doesn't make any sense. And that's what I mean by surrendering is accept your responsibility in the situations in how you want to respond to circumstances. So we're not just the victims of our circumstances. At the same time, think of a bigger picture and have the humility to see that our perception is not reality, because our perceptions are often distorted, and reality is reality.
Hmm.
But that's something I think sort of came up just now.
Wow, yeah, that's fantastic. I was just thinking about that whole analogy with the brick wall and the finger trap, and I'm very visual, so I like that. I was just thinking about when I was late this year to decorate for Christmas and couldn't find the Christmas lights. We're digging through the whole garage, which is already kind of chaotic, and trying to find, pull out all the boxes, and you got to pull out all of Halloween before you can get to the Christmas, and
Yeah.
of course, already running late and stressed, and looking for the lights for the house, right? That go around the roof. Could not find them anywhere. I was like, where are they? And then finally it occurred to me, I think I donated those with the other lights that I thought I didn't want. So I ordered new Christmas lights. When you first take Christmas lights out of a box, they're all tangled and you got to undo them, and it's very time consuming. So I was out in the front lawn this week because we live in California, and it hardly ever snows or rains here. I was out in the front lawn separating the lights, and they were all tangled, and I was starting to get frustrated. And I was thinking to myself, this is a really important analogy, that just like Christmas lights or anything else, that when you get impatient, you get frustrated, it ends up becoming more difficult, right? More time consuming. Whereas if we just kind of settle into it, the process, and breathe and just, take our time with it, oftentimes it's a lot faster, right? It reminds me of that saying of the Navy SEALs, right? Smooth, how does it go? Smooth is slow is
Slow is fast, fast is smooth.
right. There you go. That's it. Yeah. So oftentimes we get more done by being relaxed, patient, accepting the process. Goes back to the like act therapy, right? Acceptance and
Yeah.
commitment. It's the whole idea. I mean, these concepts, right, of not swimming against the current, not just letting
Yeah.
life happen to us either, but
Yeah.
like you said, focusing on what we have control over theoretically, and trusting the process that we will see what we need to do when the time comes if we're just being present and mindful.
Yeah, I love cliches, and of course, cliches are tropes. But for any saying to withstand the iterations of time for hundreds and thousands of years, it's truth.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and this is such a trivial example, but going on the analogy of finger trap, where even like headphone jacks or Christmas lights that you talked about when they're all tangled, like there is no bigger frustrations than when you stub a toe against a table edge or step on a Lego brick,
Guilty of that all the time.
or spending like 30 minutes trying to untangle your headphones or earphones before the wireless stage now. But
Mm-hmm.
the fastest way to untether or untangle the mess of earphones or headphone jacks, whatever, is actually not pulling them, because most people like to pull them,
Mm-hmm.
and you actually makes the
Attention.
messiness of that
Yeah.
and the tension even more exacerbated. And the only way to do it, because there's a lot of life hacks out there and most of them don't work, but
Mm-hmm.
one of the few life hacks I came across that do work is untangling or untethering the headphone jacks. You actually mush them together and you actually create even more of a mess. And
Mm-hmm.
through that, the tangles get loosened and then you
Mm-hmm.
pick them out one by one, versus this intuitive feeling where you just see, oh, mess, let me just pull them apart. Life
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really work like that. But yeah, it reminds me of like a lot of the self-sabotage tendencies I see with my men clients,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of times in life, when shit goes wrong or when things are not going to our expectations, because it comes down to expectations. And my favorite quote is, expectation is the thief of happiness. It really is often.
Mm-hmm.
The best what we could do is just wait. Less is more. And the
Mm-hmm.
best we could do in these messiness of life that we don't have control over is simply waiting it out, or waiting for a better response to come out. But instead, a lot of us, we dive head first, spearhead into this messiness, and we actually makes the situation worse often. And a lot of that is ego driven for a lot of men, right? I'm not saying women's immune to this phenomenon, but I think it's a little bit more salient for men. But yeah, that's something I also wanted to share.
Yeah, yeah, another great point. Absolutely. And I was actually thinking about that a few minutes ago, the whole idea of expectations, right? When we try and force outcomes. I read a book by James Clear, Atomic Habits. You ever read it?
Great book.
Great book. I love practical wisdom kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I need all I can get. But James Clear, definitely talks about like not getting attached to outcomes, because we can't guarantee outcomes. Outcomes are not even necessarily in our control to produce. The only thing we have control of is our actions, including a response. Like you were saying, we always have a choice in how we respond to something, to someone, right? And I often, with clients, will use the analogy of chess, right? When human behavior repeats patterns, right? Patterns maintain problems, right? Or identified problems, what we define as a problem. And if you're familiar with chess, right? If you and I have been playing chess together for 10 years, right? We can sit there and drink our cup of coffee and chew the fat without even really thinking about what we're doing. And we're almost always going to have the same outcomes, right? Because I know what you're going to do. Subconsciously, you know what I'm going to do, because it's just ingrained. We know what to expect, the behavioral patterns, right? But if you suddenly do something you've never done before, in terms of a move, right? Let's say you sacrifice your queen or something when I wouldn't expect you to. It's going to cause me to like, whoa, what just happened? I'm going to put my coffee down.
Yeah.
Okay, what did I miss? Why did you do that? That's not what I expected, right? From Benoit. He doesn't give away his queen. Suddenly I'm present again. I'm analyzing, right? But we don't do that so much in relationships when the pattern is maintained. So we can't change other people, is my point. We can't change other people. We can only change the way we react. But when we change the way we react, we change other people by proxy. Not because we can enforce change on them, but because we cause them to be more present with what they're doing.
Yeah.
We disrupt the pattern. And when I think about that whole idea with James Clear and outcomes and our expectations, that's a large degree of it, right? Is focusing on how we can do things a little bit differently to disrupt a pattern. Sometimes that's doing nothing at all when we typically would react, right? Whether it's marital dispute or whatever the situation is, right? By choosing to not participate in the dynamic, create space.
Yeah, that reminds me of a conversation I had with Professor Iris Gonzalez T. She was on my podcast, professor at USC and psychotherapist. And we were talking about why do so many of us have these high and often unrealistic expectations of others. And this is a general blanket statement I want to preface. At the same time, I think generally speaking, a lot of us who uphold these really, really high and often unrealistic expectations of others comes down to lack of control that we feel. If you have very high self-esteem, if you are confident about your way of navigations of life, I don't think you would have a lot of high expectations of others, because you understand that we can't even control how we show up day to day. And on top of that, you want to control how others who are comprised of different genetic makeups, different upbringing, different way of thinking as we do. That doesn't make any sense. But that's how we cling onto control, right? Is when we feel loss of control in life because we don't have control of life, we want to overcompensate that by saying, oh, you should do this for me because of X, Y, and Z. You fill in the blank with anything else, but it comes down to how you feel day to day. And might be a stretch, but I want to share this thing that my brain is very hyperactive from a lot of coffee I drank this morning. So please bear with my brain frequency. But I'm a big philosophy fan. And of course, Nietzsche is a prominent philosopher who declared God is dead in light of the rise of nihilism. He said this very famously. He talks about when you're born into this world, you sign a contract with life. On that contract, there is only two clauses. The first clause is you are going to die. That's the first certainty that we know amidst this uncertainty of life. The second clause, it says, this life is going to be filled with suffering and pain. And of course, joy, bliss, happiness, etc. But pain is an inheriting characteristics of life. Just think about that. When we're born into this world, because we didn't choose to be born, our parents made that decision for us. And when we are born by privilege, circumstances, whatever, the only two certainties amidst the uncertainties is that we're going to die and life is going to be filled with suffering. It sounds pretty bleak, but I find empowerment in that
Mm.
because that allows me to adjust my expectations so that I can navigate this container, this mystical containers of life in the most fulfilling and realistic way.
Mm-hmm.
Because idealism does not help anybody. Just like perfectionism, it's an excuse for greatness. And we have to burn those boxes down and we have to update our reality maps. Because a lot of my clients at USC, when they come to me, a lot of their issues are adjustment issues, adjustment disorders, where their internal map of viewing the world has not been updated adequately by life because they haven't been stress tested by life or reality tested by life.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens as you get older and older, right? So a lot of my work with my clients at USC is simply help them. What are your expectations of life and in life? Are they sustainable? Are they healthy? Are they realistic? If not, let's update them. Because it's not about you letting go of your old thoughts necessarily, but it's about can you navigate life in a sustainable and healthy way per your internal worldview. But yeah, it's very interesting to see so many people. It doesn't matter how smart they are, PhD students, whatever. A lot of us have very unrealistic expectations of what life is,
Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of these suffering is either self-sabotage or self-inflicted in many occasions.
Wow, absolutely. You framed that so well. We talk about paradigm shifts and schemas and the lens by which we view the world and, changing the internal dialogue or our core belief systems. But you just said it so nice and concisely, right? We have to, does our philosophy line up with a practical container of life, right? And if not, where did those other expectations come from, right? We talk about reparenting ourselves, right? For oftentimes, children don't have the most balanced upbringings, like you said, right? We are taught, we are modeled a certain way of life, but that's not necessarily the way the world, quote, works or can work in a particular context, right? Or region or where you're born, right? There's so many other contributing factors to our human experience, right? That are maybe not even within our control, right? Which require a different application of principles, right? To live by, right? To gauge our expectations. And it sounds to me that is a major factor in helping someone get unstuck, which sounds like it's one of your expertise, right? Helping people navigate life transitions.
Yeah, I wanna. This is related to what you just said, where a lot of my work, because I just turned 30 recently, and a lot of my work in my I think late 20s, like from 28 to 30 in the past 2 years, give or take, since after the pandemic, the time is very loose.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's just like one giant COVID year for
Yes.
3 years. But I've been working diligently internally to neutralize the language smart. Like, what does that mean, smart? Does that mean you have a faster cognitive processing power? Can you look at the abstracts? Can you retain information better? What X, Y, and Z? I think my superpower is my ability to connect the seemingly disconnected points in an abstract way.
Mm-hmm.
And for me to articulate those connections and highlight that to the clients or friends or on the podcast. I share that because, yeah, it is this ability to see the less obvious, the nuanced perspectives. And I think refining and tweaking our ways around that. But yeah, I want to add this because I feel like my response earlier was a little bit too bleak. They're like, oh man, life just happens. We have no control. It is what it is. To that, I want to.
I understand. I get it. Like, I think about that a lot, but it is empowering for me. Absolutely.
Yeah. But to that, I do want to add one more a side note where it's cool and it's not lonesomeness because there's 8 billions of us who are on this journey together. And of course, all of our circumstances look different from one another. All of us are given with different genetic lotteries, circumstances, and so on. At the same time, not a single person that I know has never endured some sort of a pain and difficult pathway in life. And I find that very reassuring is yes, it is tough. We didn't get to choose this life per se. Our parents met in a very synchronistic way that gave birth to us and all that. But at the same time, it is cool because you're not walking this path alone. You can look to your left and right, and there's going to someone there alongside with you, metaphorically. So I just wanted to add that to make the response a little bit more optimistic and hopeful in light of the Christmas and holiday season,
Yes,
of course.
Yalom, all in the same
Yeah.
boat. We're all in this together, right? Maybe on different stages, different islands, but we have a shared human condition. We all have the same prime emotions, this pretty much the same needs, right? Same basic needs. Going back to Locke, right? John Locke philosophy,
Yep.
right? And one of my favorite applications, going back to philosophy too, is Kaufman. I was a sociology major undergrad.
Mm.
One of my favorite theories is stage theory, right? The whole idea that we don't necessarily, because we don't always feel connected to people, is my point. We are all in this thing together, life, but we don't always feel like we're all in this together, right? And so the key, right, to unlock that sense of belonging is finding ways to connect with other people. And that's not always easy. And I think that's a lot of our work as counselors, as helpers, right? Is to help other people feel more connected, not just to their purpose, to their mission, but to each other, right? Which ultimately, right, that's what altruism is, right? Think about the hierarchy of needs. It's coming to a place where, yes, your basic needs are met. Erik Erikson's stage of, psychological needs hierarchy is coming to the place where we can now exist outside of our own needs by serving other people, right? By giving back. And it's not necessarily linear, right? There's different ebbs and flows to its stages. And, we just like grief, the stages of grief, right? Our needs change. It's not fixed. Right?
Yeah. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of my clients don't understand that life is non-linear. They have this linear expectations. If I do this, this happens. If I do that, that happens, until it doesn't. Which is like my pivoting journeys that I realized, oh, life and God, I call it God. Some people call it the source, universe, whatever you want to call it. But per my faith, I call it God, often has a greater or different timeline as I do. That's why I went through all these career pivots, near death deployment in the past like 6, 7 years. But to you, Patrick, like how do you help your clients or people you interact with understand and truly internalize this timeless truth that life is non-linear?
I think first by seeking understanding of what their lived experience is and kind of their narrative, right? And then helping them zoom out a little bit just to look for other ways to view their situation or to see their life from other people's perspectives, be that their caregivers, their siblings, their other people that have shared their experiences, and help them see themselves objectively a little bit, right? Because that's a very challenging thing for any of us to do, right? Is to see our own existence from an outside perspective, right? And because I'm very visual, and this is why I love podcasting, right? This is absolutely why I love podcasting, listening to podcasts. I mean, before I started one, much like you, is because, some clients will ask me, how do I cope? And I'll say, I'm very mindful about what goes in here, right? What feeds my mind. I'm not just absorbing, right? Scrolling, or even listening to music, which is great. I'm trying to keep my mind intrigued, inspired, right? And, with practical wisdom or podcasts or listening to other people's stories. And I think as counselors, we get that on a regular basis because we're constantly listening to people's life stories. But most people don't have that. Most people live a very egocentric life. They are kind of feel like an island a lot of times. I'm sure it's a very subjective experience. And so they don't get an opportunity oftentimes to see the world from other people's perspectives. And if we're only looking at the world through our own experience and focusing on our own problems, it's kind of hard to train our brain to think about the flexibility, right? The malleability of life, that it's not if this, then that, right? That there's a plethora of options all the time and change can happen anytime we want. In most cases, not maybe absolute changes. Like you're not going to become a doctor overnight,
Yeah.
right? But if you want to be a better student, you can learn those skills. You can affect change. And I think really helping clients, consumers, help seekers find points of intervention when they see that they can affect change in the here and now to improve the moment, going back to like DBT principles, right? Even if you're dysregulated, even if you're emotionally stuck, there's always ways to improve the moment, right? All of that to me comes from perspective, ways to get outside of our own fixed beliefs, even, and try and see things from other possibilities. Because that's how I get unstuck. That's how I break the linear, right? I try and find a vision for the possibilities rather than focusing on my absolute expectations. And that's a hard thing. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. Yeah, the because I feel like a lot of us don't really think about the 6 inches between our ears, which is our headspace and brain. And of course, this is not my original thoughts. Other great thinkers have said this many, many times, but they often talk about we need to care about our mind or mental nutrition, what we intake nutritionally through the mind, through knowledge, information, stories, whatever, versus just having all this junk through TikTok and other
Mm-hmm.
technological front ends that's happening that's not always conducive for growth. At the same time, not everything has to be growth. Of course, I do understand that there is a need and place for everything. So that's something I wanted to share. And also, speaking of the moment, because I feel like when people talk about life is linear,
Mm-hmm.
that's not conducive because if life were linear, that means it's bi-directional. What I mean by that is if life is truly linear, which is not, if in this moment you feel sad and depressed, if life were linear, that means you're going to stay sad and depressed for a long time. But that's not the case. According to Google University, a moment is, I think, 30 to 90 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is we have the power to rewrite our emotions and rewrite the chapters of our life moment by moment.
Mm-hmm.
I come from an eclectic background, but I'm very big on mindfulness. I've been a daily meditator for the past 3, 4 years. And I work with mindfulness, self compassion, group therapy with my clients as well at USC. And that's what we talk a lot about is just because you're feeling some type of way, good or bad, in that moment, that's not a predictor for how you're going to feel for the next moment or for the next 20 moments, for the next hours.
Mm-hmm.
We always have the capacity and the power to rewrite our realities moment by moment, only if you recognize and acknowledge the capacity and the power that we all have. And I think that to me is what mental health is, that you don't have to accept your reality as is. At the same time, there is always something we can do about it. And that's the empowerment, is we have the capacity of action and decision making if we choose to. Not that it's always easy, but I think a lot of gateways open up once you make a decision and you embark forward. Then I think we'll be often surprised by what life has in place for us on the other side.
Absolutely. Remember that no feeling is final, right? That no feeling is final. And we talked about that a lot in before the pandemic when I was running cognitive behavioral therapy groups and stuff. Is a big part of the module on depression is that pleasure predicting is very skewed, right? You can't even trust our own feelings a lot of the time, or how much we will actually benefit from something, a planned activity, a healthy activity, right? And so then we have to trust the process that's that whole idea of behavioral activation, right?
Right.
That's why it's an intervention, right? Is that sometimes if we can remove the time that we allow to talk ourselves out of something that's good for us and just do what we know is good for us, then we have that biofeedback, right? And that elicits more positive emotions and then so forth, right? And that gets the positive snowball going again. But great point. Again, that it's easy to feel like life is linear and that it'll always be this way, but we know it's not, right? We know that no feeling is final, no circumstance is the same. And going back to even that prior question you were asking me, how do I help clients identify, get to a place where they understand that life isn't linear is their goals, right? Because I feel like that's at the crux of a lot of anxiety for clients, especially from, households where they are expected to check the boxes, right? And do things in a particular order, go to college, get married, have a career, And if there's a lot of pressure, especially familial pressure, because this is just what we do in this family, then if they don't check a box, or if they're struggling and they don't feel like they can be transparent about that, then suddenly they are a failure, or there's shame and there's guilt. Or even on the opposite side of the spectrum, right? For someone who maybe didn't grow up with that structure, then there's the comparative thinking. They're looking to the people who are chained to that structure, and they're envious, whereas the people who are chained to the structure are maybe looking to those who maybe don't have those high expectations and are envious of that. And I think we get so caught up in what we think we quote should be. We should all over ourselves, and it creates a lot of anxiety. If we can learn that things don't have to happen in a particular order in order to have a quality life, a life that we're happy with, I think that's very free. And I see this a lot with, especially when I'm working with 20 somethings, with a lot of anxiety about this stuff, or, I'm never going to meet the love of my life. I'm never going to have that career I want. And I have to remind them that, do you realize that the divorce rate is 50%? Not that it's a good thing, but people are starting over all the time. People are recreating themselves all the time. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that. With the Great Resignation, right? Of people walking away from their jobs and recalibrating, rethinking about what it is they want, and this is not new, right? If we look at history, the Great Depression, if you ever read that book by Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, great book. It's not actually about making money.
Yeah.
It's like the foundation of all other self-help books on the planet. Think and Grow Rich is about mindset. It's about understanding the difference between tribulations and opportunities, and they're not mutually exclusive, right? It's understanding that in spite of any circumstance, what's going on in society, what's going on in the world, we always have options to recreate ourselves. And really the key is inspiration and curiosity. If we can get curious about life and stop assuming what we think we know about how life works, and give ourselves permission to dream like when we were kids with our imagination and possibilities, I don't know where we lose that, but somewhere along the line it becomes an atrophied muscle, right, of our mental health, is giving ourselves permission to dream and imagine. That's why Disney's so popular, right?
Yeah.
Because that's their currency, right? And I think we all connect with that from our childhood. Like, oh yeah, this feels good to think about possibilities, right? And for me, that's one of the primary goals of counseling, is to help people get back to that place where they see and feel the possibilities of life, that it's not just about checking the boxes.
Yeah. If I think the major takeaway from our conversations today, of course, there's more coming, but we need to burn down this vocab of should. Mm-hmm. I call it don't shit yourself. Like, don't should yourself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like, according to who? Oh, I should have a mortgage paid for a house, a loving, healthy, committed marriage, and amazing in my career by age 30. Says who? Mm-hmm. You or someone else? Because I hate that word, and I think we need to burn that down, because should is often imposed externally by someone else that you internalize as truth by someone else's limited opinions. So first of all, let's burn that word down and eradicate it from our vocabulary. The second thing is, I love mental health because let's say a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to work on mental health today. Cool. If that's how you feel, that's fine. But the cool thing is there's multiple entry points. What I mean by that is, one of my mission statements on my podcast of Discover More is to show this equation that mental health equals a health, period. What that means is, if you don't feel like seeing a therapist today, if you don't feel like thinking about thinking, if you don't feel like journaling about how your week went, that's fine, because we all have our cups of needs and our capacity day to day. Mm-hmm. You can work on your physical health, go on a run, partake in a rigorous exercise for 30 minutes to an hour, because research shows that 32 an hour of rigorous workout or running releases the equivalent serotonin amount as SSRIs or antidepressants.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
a very powerful statistics. And guess what? Naturally, by working on your physical health, your mental health improves. Well,
Mm-hmm.
let's say conversely, you're too tired, you're dealing with physical illness, and you cannot work on your physical health. Cool. Work on your mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Because guess what? Using psychology as an entry point, you improve your physiology. And that's why mental health is the underlying foundations of how all of us navigate day to day. Because I dare anyone provide a counterexample of when you don't feel good physically, let me know how your mental health is.
Hmm.
I doubt that you're feeling peaches and rainbows and sunshine when you're dealing with the flu,
Yes.
especially this year. The flu this year is strong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or conversely, when you don't feel good mentally and emotionally, dealing with the constant tidal waves of life, family drama, mourning, grief, whatever, you tell me you feel good physically, I highly doubt it, right? So
Right.
I just want to share that because that's why I love mental health, because it's not just the end all be all with one fixed entry point. There's multiple ways to work on your mental health, just like there's multiple ways to work on your physical. It's not just about going to the doctors once a week or once a year.
Absolutely. It's a holistic approach. I know that's no one of those hot catchphrases, but that's essentially what it means. It means that there's many entry points, there's many points of intervention, right? That I don't know if it's talked about enough, right? That people don't have to wait to see a therapist or a psychiatrist or to work on their mental health. There's lots of other ways that they can start building in habits that give them an advantage, right? Protective factors, whether that like diet, exercise, and we could talk at length just about diet and
Yep.
tryptophan and the importance of getting enough adequate protein and healthy fats in your diet in order to even secrete serotonin, or that most people who struggle with clinical organic anxiety and depression run low in serotonin in their limbic system. And so they need to work a little extra harder to make sure they're getting enough through that blood brain barrier. And that's through diet and exercise, right? That Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa are not bottled serotonin. They cannot bottle serotonin. All they can do is give you medications that help you recycle your serotonin, right? Like pouring coffee through the same grounds. It's not great. It's a little extra but it's not that alone is not ideal, right? You have to replenish the body, right, through diet, so that the other stuff can work, so your body can do its job. And that's also through sleep, which produces the human growth
Yep.
hormone, which you need to convert tryptophan to serotonin. So it's a whole thing, right? It's all working together. Self-care, diet, exercise, the the counseling, which is more just the introspective work of how we frame, how we think about things, right? Because that leads to stress and cortisol. And when we stress ourselves out, right, by thinking about the problem and in a vacuum, right, it creates more stress, which affects everything else. And so causes inflammation. So it's all interrelated, right?
Yeah. You bring up a really good point where you talked about these pharmaceutical interventions and medicine are not bottled serotonin or happiness or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It could actually be a extremely concerning issue if they were. What I mean by that is, I think a lot of us often negate and forget the real growth comes from the journey. And of course, it's such a trope, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, like skill sets compounds, competency compounds. And how do you get competent at something? You do that task or the skill sets through refinement, iterations, and practice.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times, a lot of people ask me, Benoit, would you, if you were to have an access to time travel, would you go back and change anything? I said no. I will never turn back the major depression that I experienced during my deployment in 2017. I will never turn back the 6 years I spent in policymaking before my major career pivot at age 28. I will never change back all these situations I've encountered and worked through. Because of these challenges, I know how to navigate that. It's like the saying of, unless you get stuck, how do you know how to get unstuck?
Uh-huh.
You can't. So if there were actual bottled serotonins and happiness and well-being and whatever you want to language you want to describe them as, That's a huge problem because they might neutralize the brain chemical imbalance that
Mhm.
some of us have, but you're not going to learn from that process and you're not going to expand your toolbox, which is what mental health is about, which is what life
Absolutely.
is about. Like you need to be self-sufficient, not in terms of this hyper individualistic independence that capitalistic America loves and glorifies. What I mean by that is you need to learn how to self-regulate, self-sufficient, and self-survive because a lot of times when we do fall into this dark pits of mental health moments, it does feel like utter ever consuming darkness. And of course, as we talked about earlier, none of us are alone. At the
Mhm.
same time, we may perceive us as being alone. During those dark moments, you need to be able to be self sufficient, get yourself out by seeking help, but also leaning onto your mental health toolbox. So, and that only comes with actual iterations of processing. That
Mhm.
actually comes with the actual journaling forth in your healing journey. But yeah, I wanted to highlight that because I think a lot of people want these short-term fixes because some of my expertise in psychedelic medicine, as I'm a beneficiary of that, but also I want to be an aspirational psychedelic assisted psychotherapist. And I've
Mhm.
had my pulse on most psychedelic research out there in the past 5 years due to my own sexual trauma journey I've moved through myself. And yeah, a lot of people have very, once again, unrealistic expectations of what mental health and healing entails. And I wish it was a short term fix. I
Mhm.
wish. But then we'll be out of the jobs, first of all.
Yeah.
And secondly, they're not going to be empowering themselves. But at the same time, like the lottery and Powerball are always going to be around because we're always going to have subsets of populations who want that shortcut to success, fame, wealth, healing, whatever.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying those are necessarily bad, but what I am saying is I think a lot of those folks are going to miss out tremendously from the actual growth that's predicated on actually venturing to the unknown and venturing the path forward.
Yeah, it is a journey, definitely, and we learn, like you said, ways to thrive along the way, and that's the kind of the definition of a crisis, right? When somebody's coping skills that they would normally use to weather a crisis aren't working anymore, then they go into crisis, right? Then they panic. Oh, the deep breathing's not working. Oh, I talked to my friend, but that didn't help. Or that's no longer available, right? My best friend died or moved away, and I don't have my confidant anymore. When we lose our coping skills or they become ineffective anymore, it throws us off balance. And so, to your point, very helpful to have a toolbox of different options, right, for the job, different tools for the job, because problems will present themselves in many different ways, right? And our needs change and what works changes. And so it's important to kind of collect your own personal toolbox of what you know through self experimentation, understanding, right? Trial and error to know next time this happens, I know what to do. And if something else happens, I trust that I will be capable and adequate to figure it out. It's like Marie Forleo, that book, Everything is Figure Outable, right? I love that
Yep.
term, to give her credit that the sense of capability or sense of capacity to take on challenges as they come instead of evading, running away, or feeling inadequate is everything, right? Because in order to be courageous, fear has to be present.
Yep.
Fear has to be present in order to be courageous, right? By its own definition. And so, would not have anybody walk away from this podcast or YouTube video thinking that, oh, you know, I have to have it all together in order to weather a crisis or to thrive, right? Or to get unstuck. No, quite to the contrary. You do have to be courageous, meaning you have to be willing to try new things. You have to be willing to ask for help. You have to be willing to experiment without getting attached to outcomes, right? Without getting down on yourself, without shaming yourself when something doesn't work, but simply taking it as data, right? Okay, well, I'm depressed. My therapist said to go to that volleyball game with my friend. I knew it wouldn't help. It didn't help. I'm never doing that again. No. Okay, so take note. Okay, it didn't work this time. What's some other things I can try? Don't stop there. Be willing to try on different things, right? Experiment.
Yeah, when my clients exhibit like all or nothing, like always this, never that, I ask them sometimes, "Oh, I didn't know you had superpower of predicting the future. Can you share that with me? Because I'll
That'd be
love
really
to,
helpful.
yeah, I'll love to peep into the future too."
Yeah.
Of course, jokes aside, none of us mind read, none of us know the future. So why subjugate ourselves to these all or nothing? Like, oh, I will never amount to this. I will always do that. Well, maybe, maybe not. None of us knows. So, and yeah, I love what you said in terms of this paradigm shift going from pathology driven to the skills based
Mhm.
paradigm. What I mean by that is, I think a lot of us like to pathologize others, and pathology is defined by studying of the root of problem in a layman's terms. Because I do feel like a lot of mental health and public health crisis issues are skill based. What
Mhm.
that means is many of us don't have adequate or sufficient skill sets, whether that's emotional regulation skills that we talked about, whether that's distress tolerance skills, which comes down to suicide risk, mental health,
Mhm.
depressions,
Mhm.
pretty much all mental health containers. So I love that paradigm shift where I do think it's not really about us being inadequate, but our toolbox being inadequate. And that's also like the growth mindset by Carol Dweck, right? When you talked about capacity builds up, it's like this idea that I'm not there yet. That does not mean I will never get there because
Mhm.
our capacity may not be at a level where it's going to be self sufficient or help us navigate whatever stressors we're dealing with in the moment. At the same time, we can always grow our capacity. And I
Mhm.
use that word always very intentionally.
Mhm.
So that's something that just came up. But I agree. I do feel like a lot of our mental health challenges are skill based, not really necessarily about people, because
Right.
it's like the idea of client is not the problem is the
The
problem.
problem.
And that's
Right.
like the narrative therapy, right?
Absolutely. I love that. We don't lack the capacity. We often just lack the tools.
Yeah.
We don't know what we don't know, right?
Yeah. We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. Which is why asking questions is everything. You know? Yeah. Remember the was it Tony Robbins? I'm trying to remember who said it, that the quality of our life is largely dependent upon the type of questions we ask. And I would go further and say the kind of questions we ask ourselves and others, right? How we frame things. That's the whole CBT, right? It's going from statements to questions, retraining our mind to be more inquisitive than absolute, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because yeah, I think it is Tony Robbins, and he also maybe it's him or someone else. They also talked about better questions lead to better answers, and better answers lead to improved quality of life.
Yes. Right.
And
And even
I
better
do
questions.
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. And
Right.
I think the humility is a prerequisite to curiosity
Mm-hmm.
because for you to ask me any questions, of course, this is an interview and I'm a guest. But that aside, for you, Patrick, to ask me any questions, you must internalize the fact that, oh, I have something to learn from Benoit. And
Mm-hmm.
vice versa. When I asked you about the linear life question, I first had these internal humility that I have something to learn from Patrick. That's why I asked you a question.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I do feel like humility is needed to be curious. And often, a lot of those people that I know about in my life, professionally or interpersonally, the ones that lack curiosity, I think, at least from the outside, lack that humility. That's
Mm-hmm.
why they don't really engage in these conversations. And of course, we do live in the death of nuances where
Yeah.
everything's about 100 bits or less, everything's
Mm-hmm.
about 20-second reels. 60 seconds too long now. It's got to be 30 or less. So there's a lot of contributing factors to what we're talking about. But I really subscribe to the healing property of curiosity. When you are curious, you'll be surprised by the magic that awaits on the other side.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, it goes right in hand with being courageous, right? Um, when I first started doing this podcast, I, was anxious jumping into interviews, right? But for those listening, this is not scripted. There's no preloaded questions. There's no rigidity to it. We jump in and we're having a real conversation based on curiosity, right? And so the more comfortable we get with that exchange, the more we get back. And that's one thing I really try and drive home whenever I'm sitting with somebody in counseling or otherwise. It's just the importance of being curious, right?
Yeah.
Getting comfortable with just engaging, right? So important.
Yeah. I think the longer I do therapy, the more I learn that humans are great fiction writers. What
Mm.
I mean by that is, let's say you had this text with someone else, and of course, how we interpret that text is always a reflection of how we feel in that very moment.
Mm-hmm.
There is a big skit by Key and Peele about text messages. It's like 2 minutes long. I urge people to check it out. It's a really funny skit, but it is so true because I fall into the unhelpful thinking style of personalizations a lot, especially via text, because you
Mm-hmm.
can't really read sarcasm or tonality or emotions
Mm-hmm.
via text, but rather it's how you feel in that moment. But yeah, a lot of times when we miss or lack certain context dealing with different humans, because dealing with different humans is not easy because you're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with different sets of triggers, circumstances, emotionality, and so on. It's always the fastest and the most optimal if we actually just ask a questions of, oh, Patrick, you said something that sort of is sitting unwell with me. What did you mean by that? Is this what you meant?
Mm-hmm.
Instead, most of us will make a certain assumptions of, wow, Patrick is attacking me. He's gaslighting me. He just said this offensive thing. And we fill in that gap of context with
Mm-hmm.
fictions
Mm-hmm.
based on what our brains are feeling in that moment. And the longer the plot writing goes fictitiously, the more off and farther you away from the truth. And of course, metacognitively, some of us can check ourselves in that moment and sort of reel back the assumptions because assumption makes an ass of you and me. I feel like we haven't heard that saying in a long time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do realize a lot of us are great fiction writers and we love filling the blank without
Mm-hmm.
appropriate context.
Absolutely.
Instead, the one question, a
Mm-hmm.
clarifying question is all it takes. And you're like, oh, cool. That
Right.
was just my trigger and how I was feeling. But I think about that often.
Yeah, me too. I remember the Thomas theorem, right? If something is believed to be real, it's real and often real in its consequences. Going back to what you were saying, our assumptions get the best of us, right? And to be clear is to be kind, right? To seek clarification always if there's anything missing, but especially in text, like you're saying, intonation and stuff. I try and teach my kids, or what I try and do, practice what I preach, and with consumers as well, is with the tools we have today, send an audio text. If there's any question whatsoever, I was talking about this with a client the other day who had a difficult thing they wanted to talk to their family about. And I was like, well, they were going to text it. But I was like, why not send an audio message on top of a text, right? Because then they have the intonation, they understand your emotion, right, through your voice, and they're not going to just assume you're right in their case. So important, right? So important. I can't remember, was it Carl Rogers or who was it who said we don't see people as they are, we see them as we are,
I
right?
think it's Carl Rogers. Yeah.
Yeah, that we project on other people our insecurities basically, or psychology and reflected appraisals. I mean, like you said, this stuff's been around forever, right? The humans don't change, so that's the good news.
Yeah.
The good news is humans have never changed in history, really. So we're working with a set data set, a fixed set of human emotions and behavior. So we can predict to some extent how to work around these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Bon Jovi's song lyric says the more things change, the more things stay the same,
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I say this in part of my own cynicism from my political or my policy background experience, but it actually makes sense why the world is burning down every single day because the world is burning down politically, socioeconomically, and so on. Is you have 8 billion floating stardust in this world with 8 billion different trigger points. So, of course, the world is riddled with conflict every single day. And that sort of gives me comfort of, oh, it's not that humans are innately malicious or whatever, but a lot of people don't have the toolkits. A lot of people don't have the educations or knowledge or self awareness. That's why a lot of people are just getting triggered by each other. That's why I subscribe to this statement where healing has ripple effect. when you're healed by yourself, it's not just you who are deriving the benefit of healing. When you are healed, everyone around you are healed because you show up better, more lovingly, through more empathy, through more understanding with others. And imagine if, I don't know, this is arbitrary number, if a billion, 1/8 of our human populations are healed, imagine the ripple effect and what that really means for societal level, which goes all the way back to how we started this interview. But that's why I'm really, really dedicated and passionate about this work because there's so much work to be done. I saw this article from a month ago, I believe, where they did a survey. It's a pretty credible source. I forgot the source, but uh, about 49 to 50% of Americans still believe seeking therapy as weakness.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, we do have millennials, which you and I are part of, and the Gen Z. I do think that we're creating this societal change incrementally.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I do think there's a lot more work to be left, a lot more stigma for us to tackle and address. At the same time, I'm very hopeful because when I'm healed, everyone around me also derive the benefits from that. And that's why I really want to encourage all of us to seek help. And it doesn't have to be therapy. Read a book, read a book about self-help, read a book about thinking, philosophy, study of human behaviors, whatever avenues that you see fit. But yeah, I do think that healing comes with a ripple effect. Likewise, destruction and lack of healing also is destructive through a ripple effect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's about which option we choose. So why wouldn't we choose the former?
Right. It's work.
Yeah.
And that's very well said. And that's why, I know that's probably why you started your podcast. That's why I started my podcast because, and it's been access to care. The landscape has changed with the pandemic, right? With telehealth, which is great. I think access to care has always been challenging and probably always will be challenging because of supply and demand issue. But modalities like this, the podcast, at the very least, I think gives people an opportunity to absorb, like you said, one more option to absorb information to help think about their thinking, to challenge their thinking a little bit, to open their mind up to concepts that maybe they'll help them get unstuck, right? And which is very refreshing for me when I see other therapists like you doing this, because I was asking myself, am I crazy to be doing this? Is this really going to help anybody? Is this, because it is an effort, but it's also a mission, right? To raise mental health awareness. And by that, I mean personal development, right? Whatever we want to call it, wellness, personal development, self-care, it's all the same. To help people live their best lives by their own definition, right? But really to equip. And so it's really a breath of fresh air for me to meet someone like you, Benoit, who's in this as well and fighting the good fight. So
also struggling behind the scenes with all these crazy
all my
demands.
Shitting,
Yep.
I should be better at this. I should be faster. I should, but it's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a lot.
Yeah. To that, I just want to say this where I think all worthy things in life requires effort. And for you to embark on anything that's worthy of your time and effort and energy is going to be difficult. To the ethos of seeking this comfort, tie that into mental health or otherwise, where we have to understand and accept this fact that if you're on a certain path, mental health or otherwise, but especially within the containers of healing, it is going to be uncomfortable. There will be walls and walls of discomfort for you to move through. Not heading the wall per se, but you have to move through those obstacles. And that's actually a good sign. Mm-hmm. If it's always easy and effortless, you're probably on the wrong path in terms of what you're doing, in terms of being avoidance, running away from the problems, and so on. So if it's worthy of your time and effort, it is going to have some innate discomfort associated with that. And I view that as a great thing because we're all about meaning-making machines, right? Mm-hmm. I'm very cognitive, so I love making meanings out of life. Yes. But sometimes there is no why. Like, why does death happen? It's especially in terms of grief counseling and grief. but it's a very nuanced topic. But at large, generally speaking, worthy journeys are going to have discomfort, and that's a good thing.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. That's a really, really important thing. And sometimes we drive by pretty fast and say, oh, this, coping should be easy. No, no. Going back to what you said, we're born into this world and life is hard, but we get a choice in how we do hard.
Yeah.
Either way, it's hard. It's hard to suffer, but it's also hard to thrive. So,
Yeah.
there's an ebb and a flow to it.
Yeah. Ebb and flow. And then the army adage, embrace the suck.
Oh, there. I like that. That works.
Yeah. To the best of your ability. Embrace the suck to the best of your ability. And a lot of us are more capable of what we think we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that requires thinking, intentionality, being mindful, and the courage that you talked about. Because, yeah, I think Will Smith said this. I love quotes, as you can tell.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can do it, fearless, do it scared. Yeah. Like you said, right? Courage is not the absence of fear, but with fear comes courage. It's like what Morgan Freeman said: when you ask and pray about forgiveness, God doesn't give you forgiveness. God gives you opportunity to forgive. When you ask for love, God doesn't give you love. God gives you opportunities to be loving. Mm-hmm. And I sort of see that and tie into what you just said.
Absolutely. Yeah. So much we can chew on. I could keep going for hours. This is good stuff. Well, it's been an honor and a privilege. Now you have your own podcast, YouTube channel, right? Would it be okay if I share a little bit of that with our viewers here?
It will be my honor.
This is your podcast page, right? Discover
yes.
More. Discover More. Excellent. And you have been very successful with this podcast. It's like you said, it's been topping the charts with Apple Podcasts. And this is on every platform?
Every platform's out there. Yes.
Excellent. So Discover More. And so easy to find. And you have a YouTube channel as well right here, right? Discover More Podcast on YouTube.
Yep.
Doing very well. And just so much great content. Easy to find. And I like your thumbnails, right?
Yeah, really thank you.
Yeah, very nice, very nice. And so anyone can jump onto YouTube, discover more, find out more about your work and what you're doing, as well as the audio podcast. Are you on socials?
Yes. I love nothing more than interacting with listeners or watchers on Instagram. So if you found anything that I shared today, some of my way of thinking, I tend to be a little bit esoteric at times, but if you're like, oh, that's cool, I'd love to see how else he thinks about certain issues, micro or macro, feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram. I'd love to interact with you, but you can find me at Discover More Podcast on Instagram and all social.
Excellent. This is your Instagram, right?
Yes. I am not on TikTok. You got to draw the line somewhere.
All right. I hear you. Excellent. Well, wonderful work you're doing. Would it be okay if I had you back on down the road, follow up, see how things are coming along?
Yeah, I'd love to. This felt like an intentional conversation with a friend at a cafe shop. And of course, we only known each other for an hour to those who are listening. But yeah, I love the work you're doing. I love your thoughtfulness behind some of your responses and reflections on the show. But I would love for round 2 down the road.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again for making time. You're always welcome back on. Just reach out, okay?
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then I would like to down the road maybe get into some live Q&As on YouTube or something different. I don't know. That's on my list for the new year, but that would be fun, right?
Yeah. It's all about looking for more avenues to provide more values. So.
Absolutely. And there's something nice about the live aspect, maybe as a counselor, like the group, getting feedback from questions from people. But this was great. Well, I wish you a great rest of your day. It looks like the sun's peeking out in LA. So, maybe go for a walk. And yeah, this was great. I will reach out to you as soon as it's all up and posted.
Thank you so much. And happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Hey, if you're getting value from this content and you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to the MHT newsletter. That way you stay informed of all the new content as it's released. And as my gift to you, you'll have some free downloadable worksheets there. Also, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and podcast, and perhaps take 2 minutes of your time to please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps to reach more people and raise mental health awareness. I appreciate you. Well, there you have it, another tool to help you thrive. Until next time, make good things happen. Bye-bye.